Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about some advancing perceptions, and instead of what we've been talking about, or a lot of the sessions I've been in all week talking about wildfire and using as a tool, there's still abilities for us to use our prescribed fire as a tool and change the way we've been doing business, and then some of the ways that we're supporting that at Grand Canyon National Park. And one of the reasons I'm able to get up here today is I have a great staff that's very innovative and likes to close loops. So when we come up with these great ideas, they're actually able to push them all the way through to fruition and see the results and learn from them. So I have a great benefit of that staff behind me every day. So some of the things I want to talk about today are just new ways of using prescribed fire. And then what about those high severity patches? Like Pepe was talking about this morning, are those high severity patches continuing to get bigger? It's something we identified, so we're going to talk a little bit about ways we're looking at that. And then some of the new technologies that we're embracing to learn from what we're doing. And then also, how are we talking to the public, which communication has been a big piece of the conference this week. So looking at new ways to do prescribed fire, we really looked at and asked ourselves some really hard questions about our prescribed fire program. As we move out of the Ponderosa Pine and Grand Canyon National Park and into what we feel is our next biggest fuel type at risk, which is the dry mix conifer, we really ask, can we do that in one treatment? Or is it going to be a long-term treatment schedule that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of intensity, and it won't just be a turnkey, go in, burn it, turn around and say, yeah, we're good. So we also looked at, do we have to burn the whole thing at once, which I also heard this morning in some of the talks about how we're using fire. Can we use the environment that we have and the site conditions to help us adapt fire to get us what we want to break up that landscape? And then we also evaluated what are the constraints that have put us in this box of burning a whole unit, trying to do it all at once. What's pushing us in that direction, and can we break free of that? And so the answers to those questions really pointed us to a new prescribed fire project, which we've called the North Rim Slopes Prescribed Fire. So you can see the areas in red highlight the south and west facing aspects in the dry mix conifer on the North Rim of Grand Canyon. It may actually be a little bit hard to see, but there's a few polygons there that we've highlighted with the dotted lines, and those are the initial places where we wanted to apply a treatment to put fire on the ground in the late fall and allow those site conditions of cooler, wetter conditions on the north and east slopes to hold the fire. So overall, it's a little over 24,000 acre unit, and then we're looking to burn between 3,000 and 4,000 acres of that over a period of 3 to 5 years. And that may get extended out. So far we've done one big year and one small year, and conditions aren't always there. You can also see the little dots that are interspersed in there, the blue dots. Those are our rapid assessment plots, which through our fire ecology program, we picked out some areas that we could get into, do the RAP plot to get us the data we need to build the prescription, and then to determine how successful we were with the implementation of that prescription. So some of the things that we did is we looked at some of our previous fires, or prescribed fires. So in 2012, we did the Range Prescribed Fire Project, and it was in a similar area. And so we wanted to look at how well did that go, did we meet our objectives, and where was our prescription at? So we see we had a pretty broad range of temperatures, RHs, and then we constrained ourselves quite a bit on the mid-flame wind speed. So we looked at the fire effects reports that we got from that prescribed fire, our post-severity burn work. We adapted for slopes, and we changed that temperature range. We found that at less than 45 degrees, we weren't getting consumption and movement, natural movement of fire. So why go out and put the effort in if we know we're not going to get the return? We also looked at that RH range, and we were able to narrow down that below 14% more than likely we were going to get those higher intensity, higher severity fire effects that we weren't looking for in this part of the project area. And above 35, we just weren't going to see any consumption at all. So once again, trying to narrow down and maximize that window. And then that 20-foot wind speed, because we're not going to have folks on the ground for this fire, we didn't have a way to get a mid-flame wind speed. So we were going to rely on RAWS data, and that put us into a 20-foot wind speed. And then we did some calculations there that set us up for that 0 to 15, where we would get good ventilation and good growth. So some of this goes against a little bit of the training we do for prescribed fire of get a broad window so you have all the opportunities in the world. We really looked at what conditions are going to give us the best opportunity. And then we put those in our prescription so we could maximize our ability to get the desired effects we wanted. So some of the constraints that we had, and they're really perceived constraints, is our implementation period. So it was discussed in some of the morning sessions, the Park Service idea of implementing natural fire after Labor Day. So October 15th is a constraint for us at Grand Canyon. That's as long as we have concession operations open on the North Rim. So our visitor experience is a huge piece of what we're managing fire for. So in looking at that, we still thought we had great opportunities from that October 15th timeline moving ahead. And then in some years, we have a very dry winter where all the way through February, we may have those opportunities to get in, apply fire on a regular basis where on years we don't have snow. So the February 15th really set us up because we know there's not great conditions in the spring on the North Rim, and we've learned some hard lessons from that. So that gave us a buffer window if we apply fire in February that more than likely we're going to get some moisture before the spring winds come. When we first came up with this idea and we said we're not going to have holding resources or hard lines on this project, we went knocking on quite a few doors and asked a lot of people what they thought about this. How does it fit into policy? Can we really do it? And we got some blank stares, some long pauses on the phone. But people helped embrace this idea for us. And so we went down to having contingency resources within 2 hours if we're seeing undesirable effects or threats to any of our values. So that's a big shift in how we've done business with prescribed fire in the past. And then we also didn't want to limit ourselves to just ground or just aerial ignition. So we wrote that in there to give us a maximum amount of flexibility. This also puts a lot of times our burn organization to one helicopter with a pilot, one burn boss ignition specialist, and one PLDO operator. So very low complexity, but it's still held at that type 2 burn boss level. So moving on, what if the second treatment to an area, whether it's prescribed fire or wildfire, didn't give us the results we thought we were going to get? So I'm going to show a couple of slides that'll highlight this, but after 100 years of fire suppression at the park, along with a wet period over time, the white fir in that mixed conifer began to encroach into the ponderosa pine on the North Rim on the Walhalla Plateau. So with the Park Service, for the longest time, the only treatment option we had was fire. We weren't going to go out and thin. We weren't going to go do any kind of mechanical treatment in this area. So we had to figure out how we're going to do this with just one tool. And we were able to greatly reduce that white fir, but it doesn't all disappear in that first treatment. So our fuel loading went way up. And then we had other fires, wildfires, that we managed for that long term and the resource benefit. And we got some high severity patches that weren't expected. So here you can see a map from 1913. The lighter blue at the very top is the mixed conifer. And then that goes down the Walhalla, which is almost all yellow pine, so large yellow ponderosa pines. And at the very, very tip is a little bit of pinyon juniper woodland. And the Walhalla Plateau slopes down to the south, and it's over 8,000 feet at the neck, and then it gets down to about 7,500 feet there where the pinyon juniper is. So here's the vegetation map from 1980, and now you can see that that mixed conifer had turned into a spruce fir fuel type. The mixed conifer worked its way down to more than half of the plateau, and most of that was white fir encroachment from that lack of fire over time, and then the rest was ponderosa pine. So then in 2012, after an extensive work on our current vegetation map and a lot of work, you can see that light blue has really gone back up the plateau quite a ways. You can also see some big red splotches up there that are aspen, and those are from high severity fire incidences, and a few of the yellow meadow areas that also show areas that in 1913 would have been healthy ponderosa pine and now have changed over to more of a grassland or meadow. So on the ground, this is what it looked like in 2003. And so this is a chunk of fire line off the Vista fire. On the right-hand side of the picture, you can see where fires come through and killed the white fir, but it's still existent on the other side of the line there. And then our deputy FMO, Chris Marks, went out and redid these photo points. I think it was in 2010, 2012-ish. And you can see that large dug fir there is now a snag, and how much more open things are. This is 2 fire treatments have gone through there. So a lot of that white fir's gone, but some of our stands turned out really well. So here's a Google Earth image from 2003. You can really see how broad the forest cover is on the plateau overall. And then if you go to 2015, you can see quite a few areas that are open now and don't have that tree cover. So those areas that have opened up now have a lot of deadened down, both from white fir and from loss of ponderosa pine. So we started asking ourselves, how do we reduce that heavy fuel at those transition zones? And is that the right thing to do? The staff went and even talked to students at NAU and the forestry program and presented the idea, do we burn from the inside of the high severity edge into the wooded area? Or do we bring fire from the wooded area into the high severity patch? Just to try and get some additional perspective. So we took that prescription that we had developed on slopes and found to be effective and adapted that and changed it, tweaked it a little bit to meet the ponderosa pine and a little bit differing site conditions on the Walhalla. And then we continue to build on some of those lessons about those perceived constraints. So we have similar timelines. We are looking at the ability to burn a little bit earlier in the year because we're a little bit farther away from the high amount of visiting public we get in the fall to the North Rim. Again, we're going to use ground or aerial ignitions depending on our staffing and the time of year and the conditions to maximize our availability to find that prescription window. And then we're going to look at new ways to monitor the effectiveness. So the tool we came up with is this high severity edge project. So the dark green areas are actually the pixels of moderate, high, and high severity that we've taken from our CBI fire severity map. And then the red lines are the planned ignition lines in those areas of ponderosa pine that are still there that we know have heavier fuel loading. We want to apply fire in there. This year was the first year that we were going to start this project. We had staff go out, implemented a test fire, and just weren't seeing the results we wanted. It really didn't seem like it wanted to grow like we anticipated. We had had a fairly wet fall, so we're waiting. And we ended up missing another window this fall, but we're set up to go back in there next year, hopefully, and really apply this and see, can we reduce that? So if we have another wildfire, we're confident that we won't be increasing those patch sizes. So we're also looking at some new technology tools to help us monitor and to make decisions. We've embraced all kinds of stuff, but we're currently working with the University of Montana and using LiDAR as a new tool. And this section here is really going to test my knowledge of my ability to explain this because it's pretty complicated for me. But Casey, our fire ecologist, has done a good job of giving me the tools, I think, to be able to do it. But we had a capture of the entire North Kaibab Plateau, including the park in 2012. And that was able to give us a really good understanding of what our stand structure is. This is a piggyback effort for us on the Forest Service, who was looking at goshawk habitat. And so our first exploration into LiDAR, we actually used the data to determine Mexican spotted owl potential habitat and narrowed down what our nesting and roosting habitat is, which fits into our biological opinion from 2009. And that product turned out really well. Good collaboration between University of Montana, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the park to get a really good product so we know what's out there and how to best look at protecting as we move forward. So now we're looking at how can we look at these high severity edge areas with the LiDAR data. So this is a Google Earth image. This is actually a little bit north. You can see the outlet fire scar there is the bright green, and then the edge line there kind of delineating where that project area was at. So as we overlay the LiDAR data, once it's been processed, it starts to show us what stand structures we have out there. And then we did some plot work to go out and actually look at what those changes are, what do those colors actually look like, so we can communicate effectively about this map and what it really tells us. So some of that pink area shows us that very high dense, even age understory, and that's almost all aspen with a little bit of locust mixed in. And then the white shows us a little bit more of that shrub regeneration. So all these pictures are also taken from during the Fuller fire this summer, so that's why there's a little bit of recent black in there. And then as we move into a little bit more of the tan color, it shows us that moderate multi-age overstory stand. So we still have some of those larger trees, but things are quite a bit reduced and there's still quite a bit of ground fuel. So that's that zone that we're really looking at doing the treatments in and monitoring our effectiveness. And then the dark green shows that dense long-term stand that we have that has quite a bit of understory and still a very mature overstory. So as we move forward, we can actually show those different stands to ourselves and to communicate to others where we're at, how we're making changes, and how we're monitoring what those changing effects are over time. So the last thing that really want to hone in on and talk about is how are we communicating this? We've talked a lot about that internal perception, what we're calling our fires, what we're talking about the benefits of fire and the ecology of it. At Grand Canyon, we have a real unique opportunity with 6 million visitors a year to the park this year. That's a wide audience. And we've done a lot to reach out to that audience over time. And we've done it in pretty traditional methods, using interpretation, using bulletins along the rim, doing public information outreach as we have fires and we have smoke in the air and we have people's attention. Well, a new idea came up of, we have a visitor center movie. There's 5 minutes in between every showing that there's just nothing there but a black screen. So our deputy FMO, Chris Marks, actually came up with this idea of, let's put a movie in there. Let's put our own movie in. So we worked with the NEU School of Communications and the NEU School of Forestry to complete a 4-minute movie. Because within that 5 minutes, there's got to be a little bit of time for some folks to shuffle out and shuffle in, and we wanted to maximize that time. It was actually really tough to figure out, should it be 3 minutes, should it be 4 minutes, should it be 5 minutes? What's really going to get a compact message across and still be within that 5-minute time span? So working with the folks at NEU helped out a lot, and that 4-minute mark was really where we fell. So every day from early in the morning until almost dark, the South Rim Visitor Center plays that main park movie, and it talks about the history of Grand Canyon and all the different things that go on, and fire is a very minuscule part of that, just a couple of seconds. And so we're going to put this 4-minute movie in between. Right now we're thinking we're going to reach about 400,000 people a year. Now they may not see the whole 4 minutes, but the video overall we think has enough message throughout that even if you only get the last 2 minutes, it'll at least enlighten folks that come to visit the park into what that is and why fire is important. So just a couple of clips here. Pete Foulet was interviewed for this and does a really good job about talking about fire and using the fire scar samples. We have a whole bunch of those from the park that were part of different research projects at NAU, and so we look at those and really talk about that long history of fire and really reaching out to people that fire is not something new. It's something old that we took away, and we want to get it back into that landscape. And then really showing how we're doing that. So luckily, the students were able to come up as we did a prescribed fire in the village area right by the the old visitor center, the park superintendent's office, and film. And so this is a time-lapse piece where you can see the smoke in the background there, and the kind of bright shiny roof there is the El Tovar. We were burning right down the hill from the El Tovar. And so it really gets in there, and you can see fire in the movie. You see the Alpine hot shots out with drip torches burning. And we've got interpretive staff and myself and a few other folks that are talking about why fire is important. And then to make it set up for everyone, it's 508 compliant with all the subtitles about the music and what everyone's saying, and just trying to reach that broad audience. So that was just a new way for us to try and reach out and maximize our message to as many people as we could think of. So with that, I'm open for some questions. So it won't be Grand Canyon specific. We're still working on actually getting it into the visitor center. Once we get it playing in the visitor center, we are going to do a media release about it, and it'll be posted on the Grand Canyon Fire and Aviation webpage. And since it is a product of the National Park Service, we're going to be able to use it overall throughout the Park Service and have other people link into that movie. It will be available online.
It was really interesting on the Walhalla Plateau how you showed, you use those old maps to show how it moved, the mixed concrete moved down and it was moving back. And also that kind of change looks like it's pretty adaptive in terms of anticipating climate change and that plateau getting warmer and drier. I wonder, are you guys tying any kind of climate change modeling or scenario or anticipation directly to these fire prescriptions?
So it's interesting you say that, Pete. That's been a big question within our staff of, are our forests resilient to climate change? Is the fire that we're putting down too much fire? Is it too intense fire? Is it not enough fire to meet that resiliency over time? So one of the ways that we're looking at being able to do that is we're actually looking at bringing climate scientists to the park within the next year to take them out to some sites. We did this with our fire managers about 4 years ago, and taking them out to these same sites and saying, this is what it used to look like by some pictures. This is what it looks like now. What's your opinion on where we're at, and how do we move ahead, and how do we educate ourselves as a park and a resource staff on, are we doing the right things? Can we turn the course a little bit to meet those changes? Because it is somewhat of an ambiguous question, not knowing where we're really headed.
That sounds like a good strategy.
Thanks.
It's not? Oh, yeah. So my question was, you mentioned that fire was really the only treatment you were going to use, and I was wondering if that was a choice you had, or if there were other factors contributing to that.
So yeah, in 2012, we finished an environmental impact statement for the park, and prior to finishing that, fire was our only tool. So now we have the ability to use mechanical thinning, but we have limited that more to our WUI areas and still look at fire being our main tool to treat in those non-WUI areas. And a big piece of that for us at Grand Canyon is most of the park outside of those WUI areas on the North Rim and inside the canyon are proposed wilderness. We want to embrace that wilderness character overall. So fire is still really our only tool on those large landscapes. But where we do have values at risk, now we have the ability to use mechanical means to do those fuel treatments and allow us to protect those values where we couldn't do it before with fire.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm curious about In terms of, did there used to be Native American ignitions, or do you think you could accomplish your objectives by lightning fire alone?
I don't know for sure within the park and the park area how much Native American influence there had been over time. It's probably a good assumption to say that there was activity that we didn't know about. We don't have a lot of documented records of that occurring. It has been one of our goals that on the North Rim, with that wilderness aspect, could we just manage fire from lightning? One of the big things is in the Ponderosa Pine, we currently have no long or large prescribed fire plans because we feel that we've gotten most of the Ponderosa Pine treated and towards a resilient state. But it is something we're looking at in the long term of what if, because of socio-political reasons, we can't allow fire to play its natural role? At what point do we go back to adding in prescribed fire to keep those fuel loads down, to maintain that resiliency? But we also know in some areas like the mixed conifer, we're confident that just allowing natural fire will probably not give us the results we want. So it's a tough balance that we're looking at, and definitely something that's on our planning plate for as we move ahead in the future.
So I'm curious, so with the Colville National Forest where I work, I really liked a lot of the stuff you talked about, and I'm wondering, so as a national park, how you can apply something like this to Forest Service lands. And you were talking about having no contingency lines or holding resources. With something like that, do you think that would be applicable on Forest Service property with a lot more WUI areas?
So I think that's a key piece of this, is that on the North Rim of the park, we have very little of those immediate values at risk as far as WUI. We don't have a lot of private land, so it affords us a lot of opportunities to accomplish these things without those constraints. So I think it is applicable to other agencies and other pieces of land, but a lot of this was the creativity of coming up with the concept, and maybe there's possibilities of having buffer zones that add protection and then still using those site condition constraints to treat smaller areas within a larger landscape. But it's really assessing those values at risk, how much threat you're willing to take on in order to apply fire that doesn't go edge to edge, black to black.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.